we see it as a promotion. So it's like, great, be tough, be brave, be assertive, be strong, be courageous. And we really encourage girls to embrace those things. And you see it a lot in the culture. We see it in books, we see it in movies, we see it in, just the kind of language we use to talk about girls. But we still see embracing anything feminine as a demotion, as a humiliation. And so I think that's part of something in a sexist culture where we see anything that's associated with girls and women as being trivial or not worth having or fine for girls, but nothing for boys and men to actually aspire to.
It's a real delight to welcome Ruth Whippman back on the show after quite a few years. Ruth is an author, essayist, and cultural critic from London living in the United States. She is author of a few books, but her most recent one, and the topic of our conversation today, is called Boy Mom: Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. In this stimulating episode, we discussed masculinity influencers, the role of biological sex in predicting personality, and what healthy or aspirational masculinity actually looks like. As Ruth says, quote, "We need to give boys a more expansive, less suffocating story about their own possibilities and place in the world," end quote. And I'm here for it. So without further ado, I bring you Ruth Whippman. Oh, Ruth!
Hi, Scott.
Welcome back to the Psychology Podcast.
It's so good to talk to you again.
It's been many years. How many years has it been? This new book that you wrote is called Boy Mom: Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts of like the Me Too movement and how it kind of led to your thinking about boys.
Yeah, so I was pretty heavily pregnant with my third boy when the Me Too movement exploded. And it just suddenly overnight really changed the conversation that we were having about men and boys. I already had two sons. It was like this kind of rolling horror show of bad news about men, really. I was, I was about to give birth. I was already quite hormonal. I was already quite sort of anxious in that angsty pregnancy way. And suddenly I was thinking, I'm going to be a mother to three boys. And there's obviously something wrong going on at a systemic level. It's no longer just like, here are a few bad apples. Oh, what bad luck. There's something in the culture that about the way that we're socializing boys that is causing this kind of thing to be normalized. And as a feminist, I was really kind of delighted by this new conversation. I was really thrilled that women suddenly had this voice, that we were looking at these issues more clearly. But as a mother, I was pretty scared and a little bit defensive and quite conflicted. And so that really inspired me to just go and investigate this phenomenon further. Like, where are we going wrong with how we socialize boys? What's happening in the culture? And what is it sort of doing to this generation of boys to grow up in the shadow of that conversation?
This whole book is extremely nuanced. It's not, you're not buying the line that men are inherently toxic.
Absolutely not. No, I think that it is a really complicated and nuanced subject. And the more I started to unpack it, the more layers there were, and the more I had my preconceptions challenged, and the more all my kind of shibboleths about feminism, about parenthood, about the culture were challenged over and over again. And so it was a really fascinating process. I had to really look at some of my own biases and my own thoughts and sort of question my own premises. And all through that time, I was parenting three boys. And so, whatever ideas I was coming up with in my reporting and whatever I was hearing in the culture, I was sort of road testing at home. So it made it, it was a really interesting back and forth because I couldn't just sort of rely on these platitudes and being like, well, girls are like this and boys are like that, or this is what's happening, or this is the way that we raise boys. I'm doing it live, and you often realize that when you try to do things with real humans or real children, they don't actually go the way that you think. In fact, one of the conversations that you and I had was very influential in that, you're willing for me to share. But I remember when the last time we spoke, and I don't think this was actually on the podcast, I think it was off mic, but we talked about some of the some of the research on gender differences in kids. And I think I was quite resistant to it at the time. You know, I was quite resistant to the idea that there were these biologically hardwired differences. And I think you sent me some research that showed me that was quite convincing that there are some differences, whether they're biologically hardwired or whether they're socialized or whether it's a kind of complicated mix of the two. The differences in the sexes is quite large in many ways.
In some areas, yeah. I mean, I would never use the word hardwired as a scientist. I think that's a word that needs to be stricken from the discussion.
Yeah.
You know, nothing's hard. Genes are just blueprints. You know,
Yes.
but they're not even blueprints. Actually, they're not even blueprint. That's even too extreme as it is. You know, it's a very hazy set of instructions. that that doesn't need to be determined.
Right, and you know, the whole field of epigenetics, it's like, you know, I think we get stuck on this, is it nature or is it nurture? But everything is absolutely a combination of both, and what gets switched on, what doesn't get switched on, what, you know, how it all shakes down. But that was really an interesting conversation that we had.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll come up later in this conversation even more, or will be kind of a thread running through everything. But you say, I'm going to put some quotes out here of what you say. Everywhere I turned, there were bad men. Trying to raise good sons suddenly felt like a hopeless task. It felt as though society was fracturing along gender lines. What I get from reading your book is that there's an awful lot of compassion, which is consistent with your prior writing as well, but compassion for everyone involved. You didn't really write a finger-pointing book. You didn't write a man-hating book. You know, you really wrote a book like, well, what kind of society can we live in that kind of raises the tide for men and or boys and girls.
Yes.
You know?
Oh, I'm really
right?
glad to hear that, that was the way that you received it and read it, because absolutely, I think that we got into a kind of cultural moment where we were very fractured on all kinds of lines, and one of those was gender. And I think that what ended up happening was that women and girls kind of became a cause of the left, and men and boys kind of became a cause of the right. And, you know, obviously, I'm not talking about individuals here. I'm talking about the kind of cultural understanding of it. So, you know, there were obviously many conservative women and progressive men. That's not really the point. But it was just like the left had taken up the cause of girls and women, and it was almost the cause of boys and men was almost coded as this kind of right-wing endeavor. And I wanted to get past that and just be like, well, look, we all have to live in this world together. And the same system, we're all trapped in this same system together. The same system that teaches boys and men to harm other people also harms them too. It's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the way that they're growing up. And so, you know, I wanted to approach this subject with compassion. And I think I had a very natural in to approach it with compassion, because obviously I'm talking about my own children.
Of course, of course. Well, I would love to hear more precisely what you see as the message that boys are being taught to hurt others. What is that message? Where are boys being taught to hurt others?
Well, I don't think that boys are specific. I don't think it's as direct as that. So I don't think it's like anyone saying go and hurt others. And nobody, I think it would be very rare to find a parent that wants to raise a harmful boy. But I think there are many subtle messages that boys receive which are psychologically unhealthy for them and psychologically unhealthy for the people that they have to be around. I think that some of these messages have to do with masculinity and what we sort of expect from boys as they live in the world. So we have the subtitle of the book, so it's Boy Mom, Raising Boys, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And I think this idea of impossible masculinity was something that just kept coming up for me over and over again, was that we hold boys to this standard of masculinity. And if anything, that standard is ramping up. So I think that we send this message to boys about who they should be in the world, which is that they should be tough, that they should be strong, that they should suppress their emotions, that anything associated with femininity culturally is somehow humiliating or emasculating for them. So emotionality, a certain type of intimacy. And I interviewed many, many boys for this book, and they felt that same way. They felt that masculinity was something that they had to perform and that was very easily lost, and that they kind of had to be on their guard all the time. And we set them this model. I think that in terms of, we don't teach boys the kind of relational skills that we teach to girls as standard. We don't give them role models for them to be these fully connected, relational, intimate human beings. And I think that's harmful for them. And it means that they have this sort of absence of learning those kinds of skills.
What do you think of the phrase toxic masculinity?
I think that phrase was useful in a certain time and place to explain a certain type of behaviour. So I think during the Me Too movement, when it really kind of gained a head of steam, I think that, you know, it was a useful phrase as a kind of banner headline for talking about a specific type of male behaviour. So, you know, we're talking about the Weinsteins, we're talking about some of the things in the Trump administration, we're talking about this widespread sexual abuse and violence. And I think that phrase kind of captured something that no other phrase quite can. I'm not sure it's the most helpful phrase for the ongoing conversations. I think that a lot of boys and men can feel very shut down by it. And it can, and especially when you're raising boys, you're talking about children. And I think a lot of boys feel as though that phrase kind of frames them as harmful right from the start. You know, it's sort of setting the terms where boys are sort of growing up feeling like they're these harmful characters, that there's something inherently bad about them, which I don't think is a very helpful way to talk about children.
Do you think the way that a lot of young boys are being socialized is contributing to this depression epidemic that you talk about in adolescent boys?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're socializing boys away from intimate connection. You know, so one of the things that kept coming up over and over again in my interviews was about loneliness, you know, that these boys felt. So some of these boys were genuinely isolated. And those trends are kind of, we're seeing a lot of that in the data, that boys are becoming increasingly isolated. Everyone is becoming increasingly isolated, but particularly boys and young men. There's a lot of displacement where they're replacing in-person social time with screen time. There's a lot of ways in which they're feeling shut down and spending less time socializing with peers. So that's sort of something that's showing up. But even the boys that did have friends, that did have peers, that did socialize, often felt lonely in the sense that they couldn't talk to those peers about anything very personal or vulnerable or intimate. So I think that we are socializing boys in a way which is really kind of keeping them from the kind of deep, intimate connections that women often culturally find much easier to make.
Yeah, well, and also I think there are genetic contributions to that proclivity. I love playing devil's advocate on my podcast for the sake of conversations. What if someone came to you and was like, are you basically making the argument that boys need to be more like girls? Like,
yeah, I mean, this is
like,
one.
Is that what you're saying?
So this is one that I hear a lot, and I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. Now, I don't think there is such a thing as like girls, but I think that we have historically done really great work encouraging girls to embrace qualities and pursuits and pastimes that were traditionally associated with boys and men. So we see, when we tell a girl to behave like a boy, you know, like a boy, not meaning genetically like a boy or anything to do with anything predetermined, but just to embrace those kinds of qualities that are traditionally associated with masculinity. We see it as a promotion. So it's like, great, be tough, be brave, be assertive, be strong, be courageous. And we really encourage girls to embrace those things. And you see it a lot in the culture. We see it in books, we see it in movies, we see it in, you know, just the kind of language we use to talk about girls. But we still see embracing anything feminine as a demotion, as a humiliation. And so I think that's part of something in a sexist culture where we see anything that's associated with girls and women as being trivial or not worth having or fine for girls, but nothing for boys and men to actually aspire to. So I think if we really valued those culturally feminine coded virtues like emotionality, intimacy, nurturing, if we really saw those as worth having in the culture, then we wouldn't see it as a bad thing to be like, well, behave like girls. I mean, that's a real simplification, but I want to see everybody, girls, boys, and every other gender, able to express and embrace the full range of human possibility.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really want to think this through with you as a collaboration. It feels like it depends on what subgroups you're talking about, like, or what communities. Like, certainly within a certain women empowerment self-help group, they're constantly rewarding each other for being relational and being having self-worth. You know, a major concern is, oh, I don't feel worthy, you know, and then within certain I'll call them bro-ish, you know, self-help spheres, they're constantly rewarding each other for being strong and tough and standing up. I guess when you use the word culture or society as this overall blanket, my head goes to, you know, well, there are different sub-communities of people that are rewarding different things, you know?
Yes, of course.
So, and I know it's of course. So I'm just trying to think this through, because it seems like on average there are gender differences in what's appreciated. And for instance, if women ruled the world, if there wasn't a patriarchy, right? If there was a matriarchy,
Yeah.
you would see someone like you would have to come on and say, we're not appreciating agency and domination enough, you know, in our society. Like, that has been gone under the radar as important, because you have all these women running the world talking about the importance of relationships all the time.
Possibly, yeah. And I think it's great. You know, look, all of these things are important, and they have different importance to different people. I mean, one of the things about masculinity, and you're talking about different subgroups, one of the things that really struck me, actually, because I talked to boys of very different kinds of backgrounds, and what was really surprising to me, you know, so different racial groups, different economic circumstances, different ages, different geographic locations. And I thought that I would actually see more variation than I did. What was really striking was more the similarities. And so people would use, like, really different kinds of boys from really different kinds of backgrounds would actually describe their experience in very similar terms. So I remember talking to a black kid who was from a very low income neighborhood in Oakland. And he used the exact same phrase to describe his experience of sort of masculinity expectations as this kid who was like a very privileged white kid who went to a tennis specialist boarding school in Southern California that cost multiple thousands of dollars a year. And they both use the exact same phrase, which is you can never let your guard down. They both, you know, and it was really striking to me that they were both using the same phrase. And what they were describing was that this kind of feeling that you had to perform, and that if you ever slipped up and did the wrong thing and showed weakness or fear, then you would be humiliated, you would be out of the loop, that, you know, that something bad would happen. They didn't know exactly what that bad thing was. And that it was all sort of centered around the idea. So, and, you know, I've had experts sort of say this to me as well, which is that masculinity is almost defined by its opposite. It's like, don't be a woman, don't be a girl, you know. And so it's sort of, it's like a negative virtue in some ways. So it was just like they were constantly avoiding that threat of emasculation, even though it looked very different in some superficial ways. The similarities were pretty striking.
Look, it's a really good point. Now, I learned so much from your book that it, like, stimulated lots of things I wanted to discuss with you. And I hope you're okay that we're not just having an interview where I just ask you questions.
No, I love it. And I've done so many interviews now that it's really great to be challenged on it.
Let's really wrestle with this.
Yeah.
In a not toxic masculinity sort of way. But let's
really relate emotionally about this.
Yeah. There are so many deep issues and implications of this. You know, it feels like is the argument at the end of the day that, like, is it just simply like society needs to appreciate more traditionally feminine ways of being? Because one could make, again, a devil's advocate could come to you and say, well, what's wrong with some traditionally masculine ways of being channeled in the right way?
No, nothing. You know, absolutely nothing. Yeah, so my point with this is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with either masculinity or femininity. So there's a lot of these really positive virtues that are associated with masculinity. So bravery, strength, courage, even emotional stoicism, you know, in the right context can be incredibly important. And those things are not necessarily just for men, obviously. You know, women also embody those qualities. So it's not about saying that, you know, we should throw out those qualities and everyone should behave like women. It's more about just allowing everyone to have access to all of these things without it being seen as a humiliation. So whether those feminine coded virtues, whether they're masculine coded virtues, I think that we could all benefit from having all of the access to all of these things. Each individual will be different. And I think there are gender differences in the sense of how much, we want to embrace certain sides of ourselves, of course. But I think the problem is that we've given this kind of cultural value to one set of qualities, and we've kind of given less value to another set of qualities. But actually, the feminine coded qualities like, intimacy, emotionality, relationships are really fundamental for mental health and for connectivity and for being a connected human in the world.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Look, this segues into, I really would love for you to tell our audience a little about the young male friendship crisis.
Yes.
I mean, it's huge. And you're right. We are seeing a loneliness epidemic across the board.
Yeah, so this is also something that I was really being led by what these boys were telling me. It wasn't that I went into this being like, oh, we want to make boys more like girls and let's prove that point. I really didn't know what people were going to tell me. I spoke to many, many boys in lots of different settings. And one of the themes that kept coming up was this theme of loneliness, that they felt that partly it was that they were genuinely quite isolated, many of them. And I think the COVID pandemic really accelerated that. But I think those trends were very much in evidence before that as well. There was this sense that their social lives were kind of migrating online a little bit, whether that was their just general sort of socializing often was done through video games, through Discord, through those kinds of channels rather than in person. And also their sex lives were migrating online. They were sort of rejecting real world sex and relationships in favor of porn, partly because the real world socializing and the real world stuff felt very fraught, whereas the online stuff felt very easy and convenient and accessible and low stress to them. But I think that what they were feeling was that actually, although in the moment it was much easier to do those things, something very large was missing for them. They felt disconnected, they felt depressed, many of them, they felt lonely. And similarly, as I was saying before, that I think a lot of even the guys who did have friends and who were, socially successful and had social capital often felt like those friendships were kind of superficial, that they couldn't really engage with their friends in the kind of depths that they wanted to. And when they did want to have those deeper conversations, they tended to look to girls and women for that. So whether it was like female friends or girlfriends or their moms or whatever it was, they sort of saw women as playing that role, which is fine to a certain extent. But I think, one, you're seeing a trend now where so many women are fed up with that role. They've lost the kind of goodwill to provide that kind of emotional support for men and not have it reciprocated. And so I think women want to feel that they have better partners who are more engaged with them. And also, I think that boys should be able to do it for each other as well.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well, it's really good that you're shining a spotlight on that. It does seem like there's gender differences in how, girls relate with each other when they get together and hang out, and how guys' friends get together. I mean, I noticed the difference. If I'm just sitting and observing at a coffee shop and I listen to how girls talk to each other and what they're talking about, and I listen to two guys talk to each other. I mean, there's definitely a pattern. I'm not going to say 100% gender difference, but there's definitely a trend.
For sure.
For sure. Women tend to be a lot more relational and intimate in their, I just don't, with my guy friends, I'd almost feel weird being that intimate with some of my guy friends.
That's what they were saying. I mean, these boys were saying that to me as well. They were like, well, I can't have that kind of conversation with my guy friends because maybe it felt effeminate. I mean, there was definitely a kind of slightly homophobic aspect to it, that they felt that maybe it was gay, that there was, there were all those feelings. But it wasn't that they didn't want to connect. It wasn't that these guys were like, actually... This is just the way I like it. Had they genuinely been telling me, actually, I don't want to connect on any more personal, intimate level. I don't need that. then fine, great. But horses for courses, people are different. But that wasn't what they were saying. They were saying, I feel lonely, I feel isolated, I don't have anyone to talk to. There was this one example of this guy who he shared an apartment with his brother. They were both in college, they both attended the same college, and they were both going through this period of major depression at the same time, and they only knew about it because they both told their parents, and their parents fed it back. Even though they were in an apartment together, they got along fine, they hung out every night, they played video games, but they just didn't know this about each other as brothers. And I think at least the brother that I interviewed was actually really sad about that. He wanted to have a deeper connection, and he just didn't feel that he had either the skills or the social permission or the way in to achieve that.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously a very compassionate book towards boys, and you do make it clear that you've listened. And you actually have a whole chapter. I loved your last chapter, maybe my favorite chapter of your book, where you really do argue we need to listen more to boys.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways, I mean, this book it comes from a place of a mom who cares about the development of boys in a healthy way. It's right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was really a strange moment with the Me Too movement as a feminist and as a mother of boys, because it felt like those things were kind of pulling in opposite directions. Because it felt like as a feminist, it was time to, crack down on men and take a tough stance. And, it's time for men to shut up because they've been so privileged for so long.
Right.
Time for them to be quiet. And, obviously as a mother, you can't really do that. I mean, I didn't have that option. And had I had 3 girls, I think I would have probably very much bought into that line of thinking. But I'm like, these are my children. This is who I'm raising. I have to listen to them, And I think that it actually was a real experience of growth for me, that I really had to hear their story in a very deep way and hear the position that they were in and not try to shut it down. And I think now, it's something that I've written about a lot, that I think boys are feeling kind of shut down in politics or the general kind of cultural discourse from both sides. They still have this like old system of masculinity, which is just like, be quiet, suppress your emotions, toughen up, be a tough guy. And now there's this kind of new voice from the left, which is like, be quiet, you're so privileged, it's somebody else's turn, you shouldn't be speaking and you shouldn't be taking up space. These don't come from, I don't want to get into some kind of both sidesism that these are equivalent.
Right.
They're not equivalent.
I get it.
They're not equivalent at all. And one of them comes with a very genuine reason. And there's absolutely, it is important for men to listen as well. But I think boys are feeling like, well, what do I do? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? And I think ultimately the kind of silencing thing, I think a lot of boys are feeling like they actually can't articulate what they're going through. They don't know how to seek help. They don't know how to talk about their feelings. And so they're kind of channeling all of that into these quite toxic opinions on the right, the masculinity influences, the manosphere and all of that.
Yeah, but I just want to double click on a point you made and really double click on it, because there is a lot of this talk about male privilege, and you have a very provocative part of your book where you argue that male privilege is actually no longer a useful term when talking about teenagers, because power dynamics have shifted so much to the point where the categories of privileged and oppressed don't map so clearly onto teenage boys and girls anymore. Can you unpack that more? Because I think it's a super interesting point.
Yeah, so it's not that I don't think that male privilege is real, because I think it absolutely is real. But I think that it's complicated. It's much more complicated than we're giving it credit for, because partly in the sense that male privilege is always very real, and that is very important to recognize, but it comes with its own harms. So it's not a simple like benefits only equation. So even historically, male privilege has always come with this, so what I said in the book is that we've overvalued access to things like power and money and economic success, which men absolutely do get. And we've kind of undervalued things like access to emotions, connectivity, human connection, which in the system of patriarchy, boys don't have access to in the same way. So I think male privilege has always been complicated. But historically as well, for this generation, I think it doesn't map well onto what's going on with teenagers. I think that this is why a lot of boys don't recognize it in this description. It's like, be quiet, you're privileged. But what does that actually mean when you're talking about young people? They're not in the world of work. They're not earning money. There's no pay gap. There's no, a lot of these sort of tropes of what privilege actually means aren't relevant to their lives. And so I think it's something that we have to treat with caution. I don't think we can see it as a simple thing anymore.
Especially considering the high rates of depression among boys and mental illness, suicide, various aspects that are real statistics that you don't want to hide under the rug.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, male suicide at the moment is around, close to 4 times the male adolescent suicide rate is close to 4 times the rate of the female suicide rate. And the interesting thing about that statistic is that usually when they take, the CDC does these sort of surveys of teenagers, girls tend to show up as more depressed than boys, but then the male suicide rate is much higher. So there's a serious problem with the underreporting of male depression, I think. And that's part of the same reason why they're depressed in the first place, is because they can't talk about their feelings. They can't seek help. They feel lonely. They feel isolated. And those are the same things that are preventing them from, when a survey taker calls up and says, are you depressed? For them say, oh, no, I'm absolutely fine. And they don't report it until it's too late and tragedy happens, which is something that we really need to look at.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And I'm so glad you're making this point. Let's talk about incels. My colleague and friend, William Costello, has done quite a bit of research on incels. I don't know if you came across his research at all.
A little bit, but but fill me in about...
Yeah. Well, I definitely want you to talk about what you've discovered when you looked at incels, and what we get wrong about incels, because his research has found that we get a lot wrong. Most of them are not violent.
Yes.
We have a lot of misconceptions of them as the school shooters.
Yeah.
But I would like to hear, because I don't want to go into lecture mode. I'd love to hear what you discovered in your research.
Yeah, I mean, what I found was very similar to that. So that there is a section of the incel movement which is violent, and the incel movement has been associated with several mass shootings and killings, and so that is real. But I would say that the vast majority of the guys that identify that way or who are part of that movement are not violent, and they're actually... what they are is profoundly depressed. They're suffering from really severe mental health problems.
They feel hopeless around women.
They feel extremely hopeless.
Which is a big source of depression among adolescents.
Yes. And I think that what I found from talking to incels, so I spent time on incel message boards, which in many ways are some of the most toxic, repulsive places that you can possibly imagine. I mean, there's extreme misogyny, there's violent threats, there's racism, there's anti-Semitism, there's white supremacy. They're horrific spaces in many ways. But what's also really shocking is that they're also these places where there's this real tenderness and brotherhood towards each other. That these guys really find belonging in these spaces and support each other almost more than men do in many other spaces and feel able to. That was a real shock to me. Ironic. And so what, so I don't know how much your listeners know about the incel ideology, but basically incel stands for involuntary celibate. So they're these guys who are either virgins or they're not able to have sex, and they really want to, and they're extremely lonely. And they have this kind of ideology where they believe that there's this sort of alpha male guy that they are not. They call them chads, and they're like sexually successful. They're like square-jawed, tall, masculine guy who gets all the women. And this is all predetermined by genetics. And then there's kind of beta males below them. And then right at the bottom are the incels. And they believe that they just have this, their ideology is all just about hopelessness. They've just given up, that they believe in this sort of system of masculinity. And in a way, it's really different from the rest of the kind of manosphere. Because generally, like, masculinity influencers are all about holding out this promise that there's this thing called an alpha male, and they can help you achieve that status. And if you just do these 10 things, then you too can be an alpha male. But the incels have just given up. They're they don't believe that they can achieve that status of masculinity. And it has these sort of two very weird effects. One is that it can be very freeing for them in this strange way. So they felt that they could really be emotional and intimate with each other. It's almost like they have no hope of ever achieving these standards of masculinity. So they've almost just given up and they can just behave in ways that men don't often behave in real life. So the guys that I went deep with really felt that they were finding this real belonging and connectivity in those spaces, which was very sad and very sweet, and all of these competing things. And then, in the fringes of the movement, I think that sometimes those feelings of emasculation or hopelessness can lead to violent impulses. There's a lot of research on this, which is this idea that it's not masculinity that causes men to become violent, it's the shame of not feeling masculine enough. So there's all this data that shows it's a measure they call masculine discrepancy stress. So it's men who feel like they don't meet society's standards for masculinity are more likely to be violent in all kinds of different ways: sexual violence, intimate partner violence, assault with a weapon, etc., etc. So it can go kind of both ways, really.
Yeah, it can. And it is a rich literature, and I really do highly recommend people follow and read William Costello's papers on this as well. But what you're saying is absolutely in line with all that research, for sure. And it is a very complex issue. The question of, well, what do most women actually want? And I think I think there's nuance here. I'm not going to say that the incels are 100% wrong, in what they're perceiving. I think they have a distorted lens, for sure. Yeah. And I don't think you have to be a Chad. Yeah. But I also have noticed that most women do not want to push over male. They don't want a uber feminine male. And I know that might be triggering for you to hear that, because of the whole point you're trying to make in your book. But I do think there are some realities of what most women really do want. They want a man.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And this is what boys, no, I absolutely agree with you in the sense that this is what many boys were finding really confusing about this moment in our culture, was that they felt that on the one hand, they were being told, you have to be this cautious and sensitive and emotionally open and extremely, cautious was the main thing in the sense of, especially when approaching women, you cannot be seen as a creep. You can't overstep by even the tiniest smidge. But at the same time, all the old standards were still very much in circulation. So they were still also expected to be dominant and to make the first move. And women were policing their masculinity in lots of ways as well. So they felt like, well, we just don't know what to do, which is why I think they felt like it was just easier to just watch porn in their bedrooms than actually...
I think that's exactly right. If we really think through the experience of a lot of young boys who grow up who aren't the traditionally masculine ideal. Yeah. Ideal, I put that in quotes, of course. The societal ideal. What they see is the uber masculine guys who are getting all the women.
Yes.
I'm just talking about the experience of being a middle school, high school student, and just seeing who gets the girls.
Yeah. I think a lot of this is not necessarily about masculinity. It's also about confidence. I think that...
Yeah, I agree.
I think that you can be confident in lots of different ways, and it's very attractive to people. And that's also true the other way around as well. It's also true for women, for girls, and what is appealing to men, in females. I think they like people who are confident, and I think that's maybe a human trait. But I agree that it does have this gendered sort of presentation, and I think this is why boys felt very confused by the messages that they were getting, and I think they felt very, very shut down and very scared. I think they didn't get a very good education in the nuances of relationships and how to read social cues, and how to, and this is stuff that goes right back to the things we were talking about at the beginning, that we don't give them this very good education. It's not just about being emotional and vulnerable, but it's about reading another person's signals. It's about seeing when you're overstepping. It's about seeing when you're boring somebody, or like taking an interest in another person's feelings. And all of those qualities, we don't teach them well to boys. And so I think what they're getting are these very blunt messages about masculinity, which are like, be strong, be tough, be a tough guy. And I think the reality of what is attractive is much more complex and comes with maturity and confidence and those sorts of things. So I don't think like being emotional and sensitive is in opposition to being attractive or masculine, but it's complicated.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Actually, I was just featured in a documentary this past weekend called Sensitive Men Rising.
Love that.
I want to send it to you. I want to send you the link.
Oh,
That was
I'll look forward to seeing that.
it's right up the alley of your book. I mean, it's a 3-hour, 3-part documentary series with Alanis Morissette and Scott Barry Kaufman. But I would love to share that documentary with you.
I would love to see it. Yeah, and I think there are just the more that we can open up these conversations and talk about these things, but I think we tend to kind of equate being sensitive and emotionally competent with being weak and emasculated and a pushover, but those things are not,
right.
They really are not aligned.
That's such a great and important point, and a point that I've been trying to bang that drum as well, for sure.
These things are complicated, and yes, in terms of, this is one of the reasons why I want parents of girls to read this book as well, and also
Good.
not just parents, people in general, because I think we all need to think about our complicity in all of these things.
I love that.
It's something that these systems, we all play a part in creating them, and we all play, to different extents, but we all have these unconscious biases, and we all have these things, and I think the more we can talk about it and just lay it out there and be less rigid about the way that we talk about it and who's right and who's wrong, and and just sort of examine it and be curious about it, I think the more healthy and better that we can all be.
I agree with that. The only thing that I think we may disagree on, or maybe a major thing we may disagree on if we really started to get into it, is I think evolutionary psychology plays a much bigger role here than maybe you give it credit for. I think there are evolutionary instincts that we evolved that are not just going to disappear by someone reading a book and being like, okay, I'm going to change my value system. They can't change what turns them on at a deep evolutionary level.
Yes, I mean, I think that desire is really complex, and desire is really sort of often flies in the face of our politics or our values, or and this is not just to do with gender. I mean, it's to do with everything. What we find desirable is very specific, and often you see this, people have a lot of shame about that because they often will find things exciting or desirable that are really very much not in line with their own value systems. And I think the more we can talk about it and acknowledge that and think about it, and and I think that it's complicated because nobody owes anybody desire or sex.
Right.
That's something that's a very personal decision. That is something that each person navigates for themselves, and we don't owe it to anybody else, and there's no moral obligation. And I think sometimes with these conversations, and especially in the sort of further reaches of the men's rights movement, it's like, well, these women don't find me attractive, so therefore we have to make them find me attractive, or they owe us sex, or we're entitled to their bodies, or we're entitled to their desires. And this is repulsive, and it's repulsive the other way around. Nobody owes anyone their sexual desire or their sexual any sexual act, but we do have a moral obligation to think about these things and think about how we treat other people and think about how we allow each group to show up in the world and to be their full selves.
Yeah, I really like the spirit of that, but I think that what the point, like Jordan Peterson has made, which I agree with, is that there is a gender difference, for instance, in rough and tumble play, and in young there are differences in sort of like the way that people play. Boys play with each other, the ways girls play with each other, and there is kind of like there seems to be by a lot of women in our society right now sort of like wanting to just view all of that instinct as like toxic. Like, I think we can overuse the phrase toxic masculinity.
I agree. And this is something that I really wrestle with in the early chapters of the book, because my own sons, I went into parenting with this very sort of hubristic, and I think a lot of parents, not just with gender, but with everything, you think, oh, I'm just going to socialize the exact child that I want, and that, if I just do everything right, then I'll, input equals output, and I'll just get the exact child that I want. And I think especially this was all happening within the context of these conversations about toxic masculinity and male harm. And meanwhile, my own boys were extremely physical. I was absolutely blindsided. I grew up as one of two girls that, we were very bookish, we were very quiet. And I know many girls are not like that, but I think on average, you're absolutely right that the level of physical activity amongst boys is higher than it is in girls. At a group level, obviously,
yeah,
there's variation, etc., etc. But at a group level, we know that that's true. And I was absolutely blindsided by it. And it was very easy to see it through this lens of toxic masculinity. You're like, my kids want to play with Nerf guns or like wrestle each other. Is this a like straight line to, school shootings and pussy grabbing and all of this, toxic stuff? Yeah. And I think it's hard to unpack. And also, you're exhausted and you're parenting these very physical, very wild kids. And so, yeah, it was something that I had this constant back and forth about, not to pathologize their behaviors. And I think also I heard a lot of it the other way around as well, which is just like, I get a lot of sort of slightly patronizing parenting advice, especially from men, which will be like, well, boys just need more wrestling. They just need you to wrestle them. They need more physical play. They need more this. And it's not that that's not true, but it sort of often comes with this, well, you couldn't possibly understand. Boyhood is this kind of momentous thing that women couldn't possibly know about. And so only men can really handle it. And also this sort of this doubling down on the physicality. It's just like, this is what they're like. So what they really need is more of that. Whereas with girls, we tend to have a slightly different conversation. No one's saying, well, this is what they're naturally like. Girls naturally like princesses. And so therefore what we need is to just give them more and more and more princesses. We're saying, okay, maybe this is true. Maybe this is what they like. But also, let's expand them to other things too.
Yeah. The reason why I bring this up is because the whole section of your book on why are boys moving to the right, and why is feminism failing to connect with them.
Yeah.
You asked that question through the lens of a feminist who's not on the right.
Yeah.
But just to take perspective taking here, like there are people who are not feminists on the right who would say, good, because what we're doing is we're shaming men for being men. That's their perspective.
Yeah, and I think that, I have some sympathy with that perspective, and I really, really don't want this to be misstated because I believe that what is harming men primarily is not feminism. It is the system that feminism is fighting against. I think that is where the problems are. But I think somehow the feminists have kind of bought into that same framing. Smashing the patriarchy will benefit all of us, I believe. It will allow us all to embrace more expansive, fulfilling lives, men and women and people of all genders. But I think what the feminists have ended up doing is sort of almost selling it to boys and men as this kind of punishment. It's like, well, you're terrible and you suck and shut up, and therefore we're going to smash the patriarchy to punish you. That's a real caricature of the position. But I think that I think as feminists, we have not done a great job of articulating empathy or understanding for men and boys. And so I can see why they're just like, well, this is our enemy. Feminism is the enemy rather than, feminism is on our side. It makes complete sense, And when I was interviewing one of the incels, I actually showed him this essay, which was written by the philosopher Amir Srinivasan. She's written this great essay called The Right to Sex, which is extremely complex and about sex and desire and all of these things. And she was saying, in that essay, feminism, Elliot Rodger, who was like a famous incel shooter, and a sort of incel hero, she was saying that, feminism could have helped him. This is it's fighting against the system that's oppressing him and making him feel undesirable and whatever. And the incel, I showed it to him and he just found it so odd. He was like, how could this have helped him? And I sympathized with that. I was like, well, yeah, I can see why this doesn't seem like a framework for you to understand your own life and your own problems. We haven't done a good job of articulating that.
My gosh, Ruth, I could speak to you the rest of today and tomorrow about this. I do want to be respectful of your time. I have 5 more pages of notes, which I promise I'm not going to get through right now. But this is just a testament to how much, look, I'm a nerd at the end of the day, and you stimulated so many questions I had and alternative perspectives. I always try to think of other perspectives, and how we can all
Yeah,
put them on the table.
no,
But all that aside, I think that we can all agree, the left and the right, in a fundamental point of your book that I want to end with. When you talk about what can we do as a society, you make a fundamental point that we need to aim higher for men. And I think that's a point that I hope we can all rally around, regardless if you're a Tate fan or you're a uber extreme left feminist with green hair. You can still agree on the same thing, which is that the more that we empower men to be better humans, the more we empower girls as well, the more society will be better.
I absolutely agree with that. Yes.
And I think it's such an important point, and I'm glad that you are making that point and that you're bringing this important discussion to the table. So I wish you all the best with your book, and I really am thankful and grateful that you came on my podcast and that you let me play devil's advocate a little bit, because I feel like it's a boring conversation if you don't play devil's advocate
No,
at
and I
all.
really appreciate it. I think these are really important issues, and we should be talking about them in the most open and, we should look at all sides of this. So I really appreciate that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. All the best.
You too. Great talking with you.